Chief for the Duke Journal of Gender Law and Policy. And before we begin, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our journal, what we do, and some of our staff members are joining with us today to celebrate in our final end of the year hurrah with Mike Selmi from George Washington University in Washington, D.C. We are joined by Virginia Fraser, who's our executive editor, our very able and wonderful executive editor who's done a tremendous job this year. To her left is Julia Noon, our special projects editor who coordinated this event. And behind Virginia and Julia to the right is Fritz Wurzbach, our senior research editor. We're joined by other journal members today for who will serve on the executive board for next year. They include Elaine Ho, who's managing editor, Michael Olswalt, who is note editor for next year, Julia Cohen is an article editor, Lauren Mandel, article editor for next year. Kim Kissabeth, who's special projects editor, and Ryan Higgins, who's editor-in-chief for next year. Behind him is Van Pierce, who's article editor this year, Stella Plaku in the back, who is an article editor for next year. So we've had an outstanding year, and the journal will be even better next year. We started from ground zero this year. We revamped our editing process. We attracted some of the top scholars in the nation, and we are publishing a banner issue. I'm proud to say that this year we are publishing 2 months ahead of time, and we're sending everything to Macro tomorrow, and it should be at the printing press within the next 7 days or so. So we're very excited about that. We've had an outstanding year, and I'm very honored to have served as editor-in-chief this year. Today we will have Professor Mike Selmi of the George Washington University of Law present his article on Women in the Workplace, Which Women, Which Agenda. That article will appear as the lead article in this issue of the journal that's coming out in just a week or so. Professor Catherine Fisk, our very own, will be providing commentary. Professor Mike Selmi received his BA from Stanford University and his JD from Harvard University, where he was the research assistant for Charles Ogletree, Larry Tribe, and Lloyd Weinrib. Professor Selmi joined the law school faculty in 1996 after having taught at the University of North Carolina for 2 years. Prior to entering academia, he litigated employment discrimination cases at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. He also served as a law clerk to Judge James R. Browning, then Chief Judge of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Professor Selmi teaches courses on employment law, employment discrimination, contracts, and civil rights legislation, and has also taught constitutional law. He has written extensively in the areas of employment discrimination, employment law, constitutional law, and his work often focuses on empirical analyses of litigation. His articles have appeared in law journals including the Stanford Law Review, Texas Law Review, Georgetown Law Journal, UCLA Law Review, and Virginia Law Review, and his article will soon be appearing in the Duke Journal of Gender Law and Policy as lead article. And he has co-authored casebooks involving employment law and civil rights. Professor Selmi has worked on a number of Supreme Court cases, including the affirmative action cases involving the University of Michigan. He recently served as a visiting professor at Harvard Law School and has been a commentator for, among others, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, NPR, and MSNBC. We are definitely honored to have Professor Selmi here today, and we're glad that Professor Fisk will be providing the commentary. So without further ado, I hope that you'll join me in welcoming him to Duke Law School.
Well, thank you, James. And if you thought that was an impressive biography, that's everything I've ever done. So that's it's in the course of my life, essentially. I appreciate that. And it's an honor to be here. And to me, it's a historic event because this is one of the few times a George Washington University professor could come and hold his head high in terms of basketball against Duke. And we might give you a run for your money this year since we're ranked, I think, number 7 currently. And undefeated in our conference, our little conference, I know, but our conference nevertheless. And it is a pleasure to be here, and it's been a pleasure to work with the journal through the fall and into the spring, and James and Virginia have been great to work with, and a real treat to be able to present my paper that I co-authored along with one of my colleagues, Naomi Kahn, and she and I have been doing some pieces together along these lines, and it's also, I'm delighted that Professor Fisk is here to offer commentary. Professor Fisk and I have known each other for many years and write in the same areas, and although we have similar positions on many things. There's a number of things where we disagree, and I'm looking forward to her comments. And as she knows, I tend to like to be a contrarian in a lot of my work, and it includes this paper. Because this is a paper, and a lot of my time has been devoted to issues of workplace equality, particularly about how women can gain more equality in the workplace. And our emphasis tends to be different on the emphasis that has arisen, particularly in law, in terms of trying to find a balance between work and family issues. There has been an explosion of work in the last decade, much of which was sparked by a book by Joan Williams, who also is publishing, as I understand it, a piece in this issue, focusing on the difficulties that women have had in obtaining equality in the workplace. Because as you know, as presumably you know, many more women are working today. It depends on how that's defined. Full-time work, it's about 2/3 of women. 75% of women with children are working. And there's been a substantial shift of women into the workplace over the last several decades, although it's slowed down in the last 3 or 4 years. And that slowdown has received significant press attention. And it's slowed down among professional women, and what else is just wealthy women. But part of that slowdown is attributable to the fact that it has not been as easy for women to gain equality once they're in the workplace as had been expected. Women are still paid less than men. Although the wage gap has decreased, it's still in the neighborhood of about 80%, again, depending on how you measure that wage gap. Women have not succeeded in gaining the foothold in the executive suite that they expected. Men still dominate, and increasingly women are becoming frustrated with the gains they've made in the workplace, and that has caused a number of women to drop out of workforce, and lots of attention focused on those women who are dropping out. A significant fact, too, lurking in the background is the fact that equality in the home has not equalized in the way that many people had hoped or expected as women entered the workforce. Women are still doing the bulk of the work in the home. That gap, too, has narrowed. Women do about 3 times as much work as men in the home, but that's down from about 6 times as much. So it has been a significant decrease. A lot of that decrease in the gap has been that women are doing less work in the home as they contract out more and as they simply do less around the home because they have less time. And men are doing slightly more, but only slightly more than they used to do. And one of the common refrains you hear today is that women are realizing that they really can't have it all and are trying to figure out what to do. There was an interesting article in the New York Times this last weekend where women were bemoaning the fact that it was hard to work and also maintain the home full-time. And that's true. It's hard to do 2 full-time jobs. Nobody would deny that. But a lot of the solutions that are proposed for the difficulties that women have encountered, what we argue in this paper, would benefit a very select group of women. Typically, the reforms that are suggested are to increase part-time work, to make part-time work more desirable for women, to increase the Family Medical Leave Act, to amend the Family Medical Leave Act as a way of also providing more time for women to take time off from work, and also to try and move towards shorter work weeks. 35-hour, there's a number of scholars who have been advocating a 35-hour work week as a way of allowing women to obtain more balance between their demands of the work and home in that. And we think that's all backwards, essentially. Most of those reforms emphasize women, enabling women to spend more time out of the workplace so that they can spend more time in the home. And we believe that the focus ought to be on enabling women to spend more time in the workplace and less time at home if we're concerned with achieving some means of equality in the workplace. And that is our focus, is trying to achieve equality in the workplace and not trying to achieve allowing women to balance all the demands that they have or trying to have it all. Because one of the things to keep in mind when we focus on that women can't have it all, well, men don't either. Men who are shirking their duties in the home are losing the gains and the benefits that one gets at spending time in the home or spending time with their children. Men are sacrificing the home for their work in many instances, and women are sacrificing work for their home in some instances as well. And it's nobody can really have it all. And I think one of the reasons why we're a bit stalled in the quest for equality or figuring out how we ought to go about gaining women more equality is because people don't really know what the objective ought to be. And we argue that it should be that men and women should have the same choices, that they should be able to have the same choices, but not different choices, that women shouldn't be entitled to different choices, that women shouldn't be entitled to both a substantial career in the workplace that's part-time so that they can spend time in the home. And so we emphasize different reforms, including lengthening the school day, providing more publicly financed childcare, emphasizing domestic violence and remedying domestic violence for women so that that to the extent that it interferes with their workplace duties, and also, and in this piece, less so in this piece, but emphasizing the importance of education for women, because our focus is on women at the lower end of the strata and not professional women. And that's when the title of the paper, Women in the Workplace, Which Women, Whose Agenda, we contend that there are very different objectives between professional women and non-professional women. And most of the literature and most of the attention is focused on professional women. And to us, they should be the folks of least interest. Although all of you who look at me are thinking that that seems wrong because you're about to be professional women. Many of you, some of you will be professional men. But we think that as a policy matter, professional women should be of our least concern as opposed to the most. So one thing I want to begin with is debunking some of the myth with respect to working hours, because lots of the reform efforts and lots of the literature is premised on a mistaken notion that people, women in particular, are working too much, that there has been a surge in work hours and that everyone is working 50 or 60 hours a week, and that these long work hours or long work weeks makes it difficult to balance the demands of home. And it turns out that it's not true at all in terms of the explosion in work hours. For the most part, and there's this very interesting book by Kathleen Gerson and Jerry Jacobs that came out a couple years ago that really goes through all the data in a very careful way. And what they conclude is that the increase that people are feeling in terms of the work hour is a result of women working, not women working exceptional hours, but women entering the workforce, that there has been this substantial increase of women entering the workforce, but that most people are not working 50 or 60-hour weeks. Most people are not lawyers, thankfully, and because if they were, there wouldn't be enough work to go around. Lawyers do tend to work long hours, but that's a very small group of individuals. And it's about 7 to 15% of women are working more than 50 hours a week, a relatively small group. And the average hours that women work is 36. Women still work less than men. The average hour work for men are 42. Men aren't also working these crazy hours, the forced overtime and the like. There's simply not as much as people think. It is true that Americans work longer hours than most other countries. It's also true that Americans are paid more for those long hours, and to the extent people are working long hours, they are compensated substantially. And there's been lots of work showing that the long hours do produce significant monetary benefits, both in cash and also in future benefits for promotions and the like. So to the extent that people are working long hours, for the most part, it's a choice that people have made to pursue lucrative careers and to make a lot of money. People don't, may not always feel like it, but people don't need to make the salaries that $150,000 or whatever it might be for working the 50 hours. It's not necessary, and it's not what most people make. In fact, we argue, and I think the data supports this, that there are a substantially larger number of people who are underemployed than overemployed, that the underwork is significantly more of a problem than overwork, and that many women would like to work more. And in fact, one of the reasons why people, even those who are working long hours against their desire, are doing so is because their wages are too low. And that if we were to increase wages significantly, provide a living wage for many people, even those who are working long hours would not have to do so. It's a choice that people are making in part because their wages are too low. But again, it's not a choice that most people are making. Most people are not working the excessive hours that the literature stresses. One of the things that the literature also stresses is that the individuals who are working long hours, lawyers, accountants, business folks, that makes it more difficult for them to balance the demands of home and work. And that's one of the reasons why the literature focuses on professionals, because they have so many competing demands and it's so hard for them to balance them. And again, we think that's all backwards. that the women at the bottom of the scales have the hardest time balancing their demands, and the women at the top have the easiest. While it's true that women at the top of the economic scales are working longer hours, they're also paid more, paid substantially more. That gives them money to contract out services, to provide for childcare, to provide cleaning, and also to purchase meals that are prepared. They also tend to be married to individuals who are also high income people. One of the facts that's very well documented, people tend to marry individuals of the same socioeconomic status. So hardworking, well-compensated women are also married to hardworking, well-compensated men for the most part. And that also gives them more flexibility in some ways because they have more money to purchase care. And also it tends to women, when women are working like that in those long hours, their partners are more likely to be supportive of contracting out services, less likely to have traditional viewpoints in terms of women's proper place and the like in that. And so they, just simply because they have more money and more ability to contract out, are more able to attain some balance between the work and family. They also have better benefits. They have more access to health insurance. They have more access to sick leave. One of the things that's become very clear in the last few years is the number of people who have no sick leave at all. I think we all take for granted that sick leave is an accepted benefit, but upwards of 50% of the workforce, almost all of whom are in the lower strata of the income scale, have no access to paid sick leave at all, and they have the least ability to balance the demands of work and home. The women at the higher end have much greater ability. And it's also the case that individuals who, even though they're working long hours, highly compensated individuals, have the most flexibility to determine when they want to work. They may be working at home, they may be able to work on the weekends, and that may not sound desirable, but they can structure it for the most part. They have more responsibility, and they have more ability to gain flexibility. Individuals at the lower end of the scale don't have any of that flexibility. They're required to work from 9 to 5 or whatever it might be in that. So the first part of our paper, we contend that the focus on professional women is misplaced, and the emphasis on overwork is also misplaced, that it's at least as significant a problem that people are working too little, and there's a significant group of underemployed individuals who would like to be working more. And as a result, you can sort of see where this is going in terms of the focus on part-time work and shorter work hours and the like. We think that those would be bad policy developments, and that there's almost no reason to believe that they would be good. Focusing on part-time work, one of the ways this comes up is there's lots of polls. If you ask people if they'd like to work less, they almost all say yes. It's sort of like asking a kid if they want to have more ice cream. They always say yes. And people would like to work less. If you ask people if they want to work less for less money, they all say no. The polls are very clear that people would like to work less to balance the home and work demands, but they won't do it if that entails losing significant income, and it would. There's no particular reason to think that part-time work is going to be of benefit to anyone other than highly compensated individuals, because lower compensated individuals simply can't afford the part-time work, which would entail a significant cut in pay. It's also the case that there's in countries where part-time work is more established, it becomes women's work, and it becomes women's work that are largely dead-end jobs that don't lead to promotion, are underpaid, and that only women do. Lots of European countries have significant part-time sectors, and they're almost all dominated by women. The Netherlands is one. People think of the Netherlands as a very progressive place. But their part-time sector is almost all women, and almost all women who are married with children work part-time in the Netherlands, in large part because their children come home for lunch for 2 hours during the day, which is not going to facilitate working full-time. And if you have traditional gender values and beliefs, the woman is going to be the one to sacrifice in order to do that. But also, even in the Netherlands where there is this established part-time work, if you ask women if they'd like to work more, they almost all say yes. Upwards of 75% would like to work full-time. And one of the things that we simply don't understand is why all the emphasis on part-time work, given that it has largely failed everywhere else. Some of the proposals that Joan Williams and others have been touting come from France. And even though Americans tend to not like France, and we make fun of it, academics love France because it's a place where you can go have coffee, eat good food, and hang out. And it has this allure. But in terms of their policies with respect to women, it's not something that has been particularly beneficial. There is an established part-time sector for women in France. There's good uh, preschools, publicly financed preschools, but there's almost no greater equality for women. France is not a place that we think of as one of great gender equality, and it's true that on every single measure, the United States is stronger than France in terms of gender equality. And looking to Europe for these policies with respect to part-time or even the shorter work hours suggests that there are policies that have not benefited women. There are policies that benefit children, but those are not necessarily the same thing. Women and children often have distinct interests. They don't always. But these, the part-time work, allowing the children to come home for lunch and the like, and having marginal jobs for women may be useful for the children. The data aren't so clear on that. But that's not particularly good for gender equality in the workplace. And the same turns out to be true with shorter hours, shorter work hours and the like. There's been, as I mentioned, a significant emphasis on trying to decrease the standard work week to 35 or fewer hours. Vicki Schultz and Gillian Lester have both argued for these policies. And to me, it's very much like the part-time. Sure, asking people if they want to work less for the same money, you're not going to get much of an argument on that. Asking people to work less for less money, you will. And the shorter hour movement, which did begin in France and other countries, has run aground in Europe. In France, they actually had a policy for a short time that restricted work hours to 35 hours a week for everyone, men and women alike. And they would also have inspectors go around and checking to see if people were working at night. And sometimes they would turn off the lights and hide for a bit if the inspectors were coming so that they continue working, because the overtime premium was extraordinary if you worked more than 35 hours. And if you worked more than 44, I think it was, they had to pay 4 times the rate. And France found that it was an unworkable system. They found, and the way that they implemented it in France, people couldn't take a pay cut. So they were working less for the same pay. And they've abolished the plan within 2 years of when it was implemented. They have phased it out because they found that it made them anti-competitive, and that lots of people would simply refuse to work the 35 hours. And one of the reasons why they implemented the 35-hour work week in France, and they sought to do it in Germany, was to reduce unemployment. It wasn't as a way of gaining a balance between work and family. And it turned out it did not reduce unemployment, and employers didn't hire others, in part because they were so constrained by the shorter work week, where they couldn't cut salaries in that. So the shorter hours, the part-time work, simply don't seem like viable options if we're concerned about gaining equality for women in the workplace. It seems like it would likely do the opposite, particularly if we created part-time jobs that were only designed to be used by women or were only used by women. There's no reason to think that good part-time jobs that lead to promotions are going to be developed or ought to be developed. Lots of employers find part-time work to be less efficient. One of the essential arguments based on the work and family literature with respect to part-time work is that it's not less efficient, that many scholars argue that part-time work is easy, that employers should have more of it. Well, employers clearly disagree, and there are inefficiencies attached to part-time work, but it's also the case that people who are attracted to part-time work tend to have less human capital, less experience, less education, and are not the desirable workers for employers. So by creating part-time work, they tend to attract lower quality employees, or that's at least what some of the data show. So there's no particular reason to think employers would create good part-time jobs. All of the evidence indicates that part-time jobs would be marginalized and would not be something that would lead to greater opportunities in the workplace or promotional opportunities for women, and it would significantly hurt their efforts. And one of the ironies, too, of the emphasis on shorter work hours and part-time work is that's really what women used to do in the 50s, 60s, and 70s when women worked part-time. And it does seem a bit bizarre that we're going back to those policies and those emphases as a result of feminist scholarship emphasizing trying to find ways to get women to be able to spend more time at home in that. So rather than emphasizing shorter hours and part-time work and the like, well, as I mentioned, we focus on different reform efforts. The most important would be restructuring school days. to make school longer so that kids would not be leaving school at 2:15, 2:30, and having to have someone pick them up. Ideally, if we were only focused on the parents, we'd have kids stay at school till 7 or so that the parents could do their work, get their kids, and take them home. Most people don't support that, although some schools do it. But we think that it's important that we try and align the schedules and that we try and align the education days to make them fit parents, assuming both parents are working, which is true of most places other than in wealthy suburbs. And One of the things, with respect to schools is the school day was originally structured around farm schedules for the most part. The reason people get out at 2 was so that they could go work, and sometimes they started early. And we haven't changed this calendar for years and years, even though we have significantly changed the economy. And there's lots of reason to believe that longer school days benefit children. Again, if you ask kids if they want to stay in school longer, just like if you ask parents if they want to work less, they're going to, what the answer will be. The kids will not vote for longer school days, but they don't usually get to vote. And you can give them ice cream to keep them present if that's necessary and all. But it also particularly benefits lower income children who do benefit by more structured school day and staying in school longer. And it would allow women to increase their ability to stay in the workplace, more continuous labor force attachment, and that would be a way that would significantly benefit women. More publicly funded preschool, full day kindergartens, and full day for us would be 8 till 5 o'clock, as opposed to now many kindergartens are over at 11, 12 o'clock. It's hard to even go to Starbucks in that time, let alone get to work in that. And those emphases where would significantly benefit women. And it'll also be true that if we could emphasize ways of getting women to finish college, more women to finish college. Women are now the majority of students in college. They enter college at higher rates than men, not by significant amounts, but some significant amounts. But one of the most curious aspects of the labor market with respect to education is that the highest group of individuals who are working in the labor force are people who have attended college but who didn't finish. And if you look at the benefit for attending college but not finishing, there's a very limited monetary benefit. It's almost not worth going to college if you don't finish, that you can do just as well by simply completing high school. And it's the majority, or not the majority, but the largest group of individuals are those who go to community colleges and maybe get a degree or don't, or fail to finish college. There's a huge wage premium for finishing college. And in terms of gaining women more power and more opportunity in the workplace, getting them to finish college at higher rates would give them many more opportunities and many more choices. And then getting people into graduate school and the like, although that's a relatively small group of individuals, education would significantly improve. Getting people to emphasize education, finishing college as opposed to starting it, would significantly improve the employment aspects for women. But at the end of the day, and at the end of our paper, and the end of my talk, the real emphasis comes back down to a change in attitudes. And this is one of the problems that my co-author Naomi Khan and I have most with the existing literature that emphasizes part-time work and the like, is it lets men off the hook much too easily. It seems that women, scholars and non-scholars alike, have simply given up on trying to get men to share more of the burden in the home. In some ways, it's understandable. People have gotten frustrated and simply given up at trying to share that burden because it hasn't materialized. Women are still doing the bulk of the work in the home. And there's no question, and all of you will experience this, all of you women, the men will get the benefit of it for the most part. When you go out working and you try and work full-time and you try and do all the work with the children and the work in the home, it is exhausting and it's not much fun. And it becomes particularly frustrating and particularly less fun when you have somebody else there who's watching television or working and the like and not sharing the burden. But there's almost no emphasis these days on trying to get men to share more of that burden. And instead we're slipping back into old attitudes about how women ought to be working part-time, that we ought to have that women should be able to go to soccer games for kids. It's great to go to soccer games for kids, but it's not something that we can expect or demand as a right, in a way that compromises work. You can have the soccer games later, get lights for the fields, or like have them play indoors, videotape it. If nobody goes, then there won't be the same pressure to go as well in that. But it doesn't seem to be what ought to be the critical aspect. It ought to be a shared burden, and sharing the burden actually is doable, but it has to be shared. And until we get to that point, or until we return to emphasizing trying to get men to share more of that burden, we're going to be spinning our heels in these weak reform efforts, weak ideas about how to allow women to spend more time out of the workplace, when that isn't. We've tried that, and we saw that that was not the road to equality. So thank you, and I look forward to Catherine's comments. And questions, I assume, as well.
It's a particular personal pleasure to be asked to comment on Mike's paper. As he said, we've known each other for a long time. I'll tell you how long. And this is a reminder, as I say to my students all the time, it turns out the legal world and the circles in which you travel is a very small world. I think I first met Mike when we were clerking together on the Ninth Circuit for different judges, but the same year. His judge and my judge were two of the three judges on a panel in which Mike and I were both assigned to work on the unbelievably tedious and confusing securities fraud case. And since I didn't know anything about securities, since I didn't take those subjects in law school, it was quite an adventure. And we disagreed about how that case ought to come out, and we've been disagreeing about lots of things ever since, although not actually about this paper. He, as he said, is or actually as James said about him, is a terrific civil rights lawyer. When I was doing a case, when I had just become a law professor and I was litigating an employment discrimination case involving discrimination on the basis of race, gender, and national origin in academic hiring, I wound up kibitzing with Mike, who was at the time a leading civil rights lawyer, on the retroactivity of the Civil Rights Act of 1991, which was an issue that came up in my case, and he was enormously helpful then. As to his paper, particularly where he concludes in talking about the importance of family roles changing, which would mean men basically doing more work at home, I want to point out he's too private, but I'm going to blow his cover, or perhaps too modest to admit that not merely does he talk the talk, but he walks the walk. He's one of the very few men I know who made significant personal career sacrifices in order to accommodate his wife's career. And I admire that, because I can't name very many men who've been willing to do that, including my own beloved spouse. So, it's really hard to do, although my spouse is a great guy. This project I find really thoughtful and interesting in its effort to get us to focus on the intersection of class and gender, which is an enormously important and I think seriously understudied topic in the larger question of the role of gender in society. I think Mike and Naomi are absolutely right that most of the academic and policy focus on gender problems has focused on the situation of upper class or upper middle class professional women. That's true both of writing in law reviews and things like that, also writing in the popular press. Last fall, I was appalled at a personal level when the New York Times had this long story interviewing female undergraduates at Yale College who were quite blunt about saying that they planned their career plans for themselves after finishing their enormously expensive elite education would be to work for a few years and then to quit their jobs and stay home and raise their kids. And there was sort of, it's a predictable spin about this. Is this because these are, privileged women? Is it because the world hasn't changed? I said to myself, this is because working class people don't go to Yale anymore because nobody can afford it. These are women who sort of their vision for what the world was to be just like their family, where daddy was an investment banker and made a boatload of money. Mom stayed home and ran their perfect lives, and that's how they got into Yale. And that their vision was that they would replicate it. And, I was contemplating writing a letter to the editor of the New York Times saying what I thought was so troubling about this whole Yale story, including if everybody believes that that's what's going to happen, the economically rational employer will say, why will I invest in hiring these women if they're just going to leave in a couple of years? And the economically rational university might say, gee, if one of the things we want to do is admit people who are going to go out and bring luster to Yale, does Yale really want to be admitting people who may not do that? So I thought it was a really interesting thing. Why is it that this is the perspective that increasingly writing has brought to gender? I think it's because we write what we know. One of the great accomplishments of feminist scholarship and thinking in the 1960s was to make us realize that the personal is political, was the slogan, and that we could see the politics of gender in our daily lives, and that we write then about the world that we know. And of course, people who do both academic and popular writing tend overwhelmingly to be upper or upper middle class. The problem with that, as Mike and Naomi point out, is that as long as we write only from a personal perspective, we're really missing some of the most important as well as the most widespread phenomena about gender and equality in the workplace, and nothing will ever change. I went to school at a time when we still read Marx, and I am proud to admit that for many years I counted myself a Marxist. I still am sort of ambivalent about private property. And I think that the sort of core insight here is that we have to make common cause that transcends class lines, or nothing will ever change. And so this paper asks us to do exactly that, to try and consider gender equality issues from the perspective of the middle class and the working class. And so how do Selmi and Khan ask us to transcend? That's the problem. I think the most challenging part of their project for them is to translate their enormously fertile insights into realistic proposals for policy and legal change. As to working time and flexibility, I think that their insight is hugely important. The phenomenon of increased work hours is going to be a reality for all of you in this room, but it's not the reality for many people. My brother is a high school dropout and a machinist. I'm proud to say at the age of 47, he finally got his first white-collar job. He has spent his entire working career wanting more hours, not fewer hours, so he can afford to live a better life. I think that the focus on the need to make working time long enough so that people can support themselves is in some tension with the way that we believe children ought to be raised. And I think, the larger question here is, are we compensating people at a level at which renders the standard of living that we believe is the best for children realistic? That, of course, is additionally compensated today by globalization. There was an article in the New York Times yesterday, or maybe over the weekend, about whether increasingly white-collar jobs are going to be outsourced or offshored, or whatever one of those awful nouns is that comes from a verb, comes from a noun. And this question of how are we going to compete in the global economy as long as there are people who are willing to do, whether it's high-skilled or low-skilled jobs, for many longer hours. But I think that they're absolutely right about the need to recognize that working time cannot be reduced as long as people are supporting themselves, but that it has to be made more flexible. And how are we going to do that? Um, I think that their proposals about restructuring society are also enormously important, although, again, very difficult to achieve. The proposal about extending the school day, about making high quality and long-term daycare more realistic are probably right as a matter of what needs to happen, probably going to be extremely unpopular because of the ideology that we have about how children ought to be raised. The attack on long-term childcare in terms of the total number of hours a day has really captured the imagination of what people think about the way that children ought to be raised. And so I think that their claim that we need to change norms about family responsibilities is absolutely right. I think one of the things that probably we need to expand is to the extent that we think about how our global competitors deal with their child rearing issues. If you go to less developed parts of the world, the way they raise children is through extended family and kinship networks. And one of the things that you see when you look at the developed countries is the attenuation, let's say, of family ties. That higher education on socioeconomic levels enables people to make different choices about the relationships that they have with their families, but then that also means you don't have fleets of older women primarily who do the child care. The more people assimilate in the US into sort of a white waspy norm, the less likely you are to have your parents, great aunts, great uncles, and all those older people around to take care of your kids. Maybe that's because you don't have to get along with your irritating Aunt Gertrude, and I certainly was happy to get rid of Aunt Gertrude absolutely as soon as I could. But the problem is Aunt Gertrude is not there to take care of my kids for me. And I think that one of those interesting things that we might have to think about is either we're talking about organized childcare in the kibbutz model, that when Israel thought about how to transform gender roles, they thought of collectivizing childcare. People who grew up in kibbutzim tend not to be quite so enthusiastic about it, or at least many of them. But the alternative is collective childcare on the family or kinship pattern, but that is going to require our thinking differently about family. I think one of the things that Mike talks about in the paper and didn't talk about here that's enormously important is domestic violence. And I would expand that to sort of the economics of divorce more generally. That one of the things to recognize about the importance of enabling full workforce participation and economic dependence of women is that that is the only way that women will be truly autonomous and therefore able to walk away from violent situations. One of the interesting things when people, I was thinking about all those Yale women sort of talking about how they were going to work for a couple of years and stay home and take care of the kids. I thought, yeah, honey, and just wait until your husband takes up with his secretary, if that's the vision we're still thinking about. And maybe there will be enough money that you can stay home, but perhaps not. Even upper class women of my mother's generation discovered that there is nothing like having a job when your husband leaves you. And this sort of notion that we're going to have a world in which marriages stay together and we can have sort of economic dependence is just completely unrealistic given divorce rates. And so I think this focus on the economics of independence as being a crucial part of the gender equality agenda is crucial. There are a couple of other things, it seems to me, that we have to contemplate as we think about this. And one that Micah and Naomi don't mention, of course, is the structure of the way that we live relative to the way that we work. And here I'm thinking about commuting time, essentially. The idea that we can have flexibility and longer work hours added onto 2-hour commutes for people who live in suburbs and work in the urban core is really problematic. And that as we think about, this is to make the proposals even more unrealistic, but as we think about how we need to restructure society in order to better enable people to combine work and family, we need to think about simply the geography of it. I lived it here, right? I moved from Los Angeles to Durham in part because it would enable me to work the hours that I want to work, but also be able to go to my kids' school or to go home, in the afternoon to check on them or something like that, because it's 5 minutes instead of 35 minutes or instead of an hour and a half. And so we think about urban spaces and exurban, suburban spaces, we need to remember it's not only a matter of working time, it's a matter of the number of minutes that you spend getting from work to home and adding that on. So I think that the paper asks us to do exactly what we need to be thinking about doing, which is to recognize that gender equality won't be achieved until we form common cause across socioeconomic class to address the need that we all have to work and to both get the economic benefits of work, to get the independence, whether that's economic or psychological independence that comes from being potentially or completely self-supporting, but that we have to address our work, family, residential, professional, working lives as a sort of a seamless whole. And so in that respect, I think the paper is an enormous contribution to the literature. I think Mike and Naomi are absolutely right. And so I'll be contrarian this time and say, although we've been disagreeing for many years about many things, on this one we completely agree. Thanks.
She just said she agreed with everything, so I don't have any particular rebuttal. So why don't we move to questions, if that's okay?
I read recently that Spain added a provision to its civil marriage contract, making the parties agree to do 50% of the housework each, and if they don't, and if they get divorced and they can prove that the other partner didn't, there are huge financial penalties involved. What do you think of that?
Well, I think it's cute. I don't know why Spain's doing it. Spain doesn't seem like a particularly progressive country. They also have, I think, we have a footnote in here. Spain also they've developed this washing machine in Spain where the same person can't do it twice. They do it by thumbprints, so that the woman would do the wash, and then the man has to do it next. So they're coming up with some innovations. I think it's a sign of how frustrated people are, and this idea of a marriage contract. It's interesting to see whether it's enforced, and I don't know to the extent what divorce that they have there. People have tried some of those similar things here. To the extent it's simply symbolic. I mean, to me, most symbolic stuff is just that. It's just symbolic without much substance. But it could make, it could have some of the financial penalty part could be significant. They have to pledge it when they get married, and I think they formally sign a contract too, as you mentioned. So I don't think it's something we're likely to see over here, but it does seem an interesting development.
How do the numbers match up in terms of women who are joining the workplace versus men who are staying at home?
There's been a fair, the popular press focuses on a number of things that, and I think what Professor Fisk mentioned, so many people write from their own experience. And so there's been lots of attention focused on men staying at home. And it's a really small group of individuals. It's bigger than it's ever been. It's probably, I think I saw somewhere that said it's 8 times as large as it is, and that's like 80 people as opposed to 10. It's not a significant movement. And there's lots of reasons for that, but the ones who have been staying at home have been getting a lot of attention. It's often thought that men aren't able to because they're penalized more than women. And that strikes me as mistaken for at least 2 different reasons. One, there's almost no evidence of that because there's not enough men to study. There was this one group study I saw a few years back from Denmark, and it actually studied 10 people. That was the only men that they could find who were staying home. And they concluded that people thought, and this was the language that they used in the Danish study, it was really cool for them to be staying home, that nobody felt that they were penalized. There's a perception that men will be penalized. And to the extent that they're penalized, it's because they're different. It's out of the norm. But it's also very clear that women are significantly penalized for being out of the home. And I don't know why only women would be penalized. If it's true that men are being penalized, that's the same thing women have. If they're being penalized more, that might be something different, but there's not much evidence on that. So there's, the trend of men staying home is small, and it tends to be professional men who are married to professional women too. And I don't think it's going to be increasing significantly. To me, it's a good development for that, but I also think that they get much too much attention given the size.
I still have a couple of concerns about your paper, and I was just wondering how you might address this. For instance, I don't understand how increasing childcare, making school longer and things like that are going to stop me from having to go home at night and still take care of my kids all evening and still, clean the house. I mean, childcare is obviously not the whole issue here. And why not work to, I mean, this was a radical feminist proposal in the 70s, but why not work to actually give housework and reproductive labor a value once again, instead of pouring subsidies into educational programs, school districts and childcare. Why don't we pour it into subsidies for women or men who choose to stay home or work less hours in order to perform childcare or household kinds of duties? Don't you think that giving new value to that reproductive labor that has to be done every day might be a more effective way of ensuring that equality in the house is happening?
Two things. First, you said you're still going to have to go home and take care of the kids, and there's no reason why that should be your sole burden. Right? That's a shared burden, and it's true that that's going to take time. That's going to take time, whoever does it. And there's no way around it, but it shouldn't just be the woman. It shouldn't just be one person. That should be shared. With respect to changing the value, I guess I have two thoughts of that. One, I just don't see how we would get there. I mean, as a realistic matter, I don't see a way that we could revalue. We should. There's a lot of things we ought to do. We ought not to pay athletes more than teachers. We ought to value our children more. We ought to assume employees or parents. But there's so many, it would be such a restructuring that we'd have to do, and I just don't see us getting there. And in our real lives, we don't do that. For people to take care of kids, we hire people who don't speak English, who have no experience taking care of kids other than the fact that they're women, and we pay them very poorly. So even in our own lives, we don't actually value it to the extent that we ought to. And it seems like we're so far from doing that. And I still would be concerned if we did that in a way that it was only women who were doing the homework. Now, there's some sense that if we actually revalued it, paid it or whatever, more men would be doing it. But that's even, an additional step removed. So while I think the ideas are interesting, it doesn't seem, it seems even less workable than many of the things that we're talking about.
Mike, it sounds like your basic framework or starting point is to achieve a goal of, I was going to say maximizing women's well-being, but it's probably more, complete equality of gender well-being. Subject to a constraint that well-being of children not be seriously impaired. But that seems to be about the only place children come in is kids have to be okay, but their welfare doesn't have to be maximized. Why start from there? I mean, why not start from let's maximize the well-being of children subject to constraint that parents not be driven into the ground?
Well, I'm not sure we would get to any different place. I think you're right that our emphasis is on attaining workplace equality with a focus on women and not a focus on children. And in fact, in a different piece that we did a while back, we were explicit about that. We don't want children to be hurt, but our emphasis is not on the children's well-being. The problem that I think we're at now when we focus on children's well-being is that the women are the ones who are expected to make the sacrifices for the children's well-being. If we were starting from scratch and trying to and emphasize what is in the best interest of children, and we had a gender-neutral perspective on how to make that come about, I wouldn't have a problem with that. It would likely mean that we would all emphasize working less and we would restructure things. But to the extent women are going to be the ones to focus or make the sacrifices necessary for the children's well-being, that to us is far more problematic. And what we are really trying to do is get to a place where men and women have the same choices. They don't currently. And once we get to a place, and that's why also we're focusing on lower income women as opposed to higher income women, the people who don't have choices. Most higher income women do have choices. They don't always like, they'd like to have more choices. But we want to get to a place where they have the same choices as our equality. And that there's no reason why children's well-being would be sacrificed in that. It's just not the emphasis for us.
You've argued that over the past 4 years, the number of women in the workplace is stagnating or downtrending. And you said you think part of that is because women aren't finding upward mobility in terms of getting executive positions, those types of things. Do you think that part of the explanation is also who's occupying all three branches of government right now and those emphasis on traditional values, and also the emphasis on security issues as opposed to domestic equality type issues?
I don't know. This would be the real answer. It's again data that has received a lot of attention. It's a small dip, but why it's gotten attention is it's the first dip in I think 30 years, or the first time it's stagnated. And now in the last, I think the most recent report, it did show a little bit of a decrease in women workplace, but the trend has been increasing up until now. I think it probably does have something to do with the traditional values emphasized, but I think the trend began in the Clinton administration too. I don't think it's just related to this administration. And I don't, the Clinton administration they tried to do some things that were useful. But one of the things that has been frustrating, the Family Medical Leave Act, which we talked about in here, provides unpaid leave, up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave, which benefits almost no one. The only people it benefits are people who typically have extensive vacation, wealthy individuals who don't need unpaid leave. And there has been absolutely no effort to move towards paid leave, which would help folks. And they can't even get the act amended to allow people to attend PTA meetings, which to me is not a significant event, but it is significant that they can't even get any legislative traction for something so simple like as that. So even during the Clinton administration, there was not much progress made. More than Bush, the Bush administration did try and get rid of the Women's Bureau in the Department of Labor and then backed off of it when they got a lot of flack for that. So they've been more hostile from that.
It seems to me kind of a key to changing workplace norms is to somehow create a space for men to be more assertive. And by that I mean, to have a man come in and ask for paternity leave. And, I think there's something very telling in probably that sort of initial reaction that he gets from the boss. And my guess would be that it's often surprise or shock. And I'm just wondering if you can think of any ways to kind of make inroads there. I mean, one sort of elephant I see in the living room I noticed you didn't talk about is healthcare, and the fact that for so many people, their jobs is inextricably linked to healthcare, which therefore is linked to the family. So it seems like there's so much incentive to not push for men, and it's difficult for me to think. I'm not sure how to reverse that.
Funny you should mention that. In a different paper, in different work, I'm advocating that we take healthcare out of the employment relationship, that employers no longer provide it for a variety of reasons, and that would be one of them. I think you're right, that the perception of people is when they go in and ask for paternity leave, they're going to be laughed at or it's going to be harmful. But women don't get laughed at, but they are penalized, and it's just a slightly different reaction. And it will only change when more and more men go in and ask, and that becomes the norm. And if people are afraid to break that, we will be in this cycle. And it's you guys who do have some power to do it. It's my students. It's people who have it's not the lower. This is where professional individuals can make a difference because they do have the bargaining power that lower income individuals don't. And to change that norm, and it's tremendously rewarding to spend that time with your children as well. That's the part that men have largely been missing. And that's the part when people say, well, men are having it all. They're not. They're missing all of that. And even if you're laughed at, it'll be worth doing. And it will, over time, the laughter will stop if that becomes part of the norm. Because employers currently penalize women for taking leave, but they can't penalize everyone. Or if they're penalizing everyone, it's not a penalty. And so if men also expect to take leave, employers at some point just have to, that will be factored in. they can currently penalize women because it's only women who are taking it. And so that will actually benefit everyone if it becomes a norm for both genders. And I have also advocated, sort of in a footnote, because this is part of my communist sense, that men should be required to take leave, forced to take leave, which they actually, the Swedish Communist Party proposed in the 1970s, which is, I think, the first time I've admitted that. That's where it came from.
Well, unfortunately, our time has expired in the reservation for the room was until 1:15.
No.
So Mike, I'd like to thank you again for your lead article in this journal. And Catherine, thank you for your commentary.